Okay, hi everyone and welcome. My name is Holly Joseph. I am the Director of the Centre for Literacy and Multilingualism, or CeLM, at the University of Reading, and really happy to see lots of you here today from the University of Reading and beyond. So most of you probably know about CeLM already, so I won't take very long. I'll just say a couple of words about CeLM. So we're a research centre within the University of Reading. We're interdisciplinary, and our mission is to conduct research, engage with practitioners and the general public, and train the next generation of researchers. And our research spans 5 themes, which are literacy and literature, that's a new one, migration, health, cognition and neuroscience, and education. And this afternoon's talk is, I guess, Vishnu is hosting today's talk, and he is the co-theme lead for health, but I think it goes beyond health to some of the other themes as well, which we'll hear about. So just a little bit of housekeeping from me before I pass over to Vishnu, who will introduce our speaker today. So I am recording today's session, just to let you know. If you don't want to be on camera, please feel free to turn your cameras off. Please also turn your microphones off throughout the talk, and then you're very welcome to come on camera and on mic at the end to ask any questions, and also feel free to use the chat to ask questions at any time during the talk as well. I think that's all the housekeeping from me. And yeah, sorry, just to add that the recording will probably post onto our YouTube channel, which I'll share a link to in a moment. So yes, really happy to see everyone today, and I'll pass over to Vishnu, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Holly. So it's my absolute privilege and honor to invite Draško Kašćelan. Did I get that right, Draško?
Yeah, doing well.
To CeLM and one of the first seminar series. And Draško is currently a lecturer in language and communication sciences at the School of Health and Social Care at University of Essex. And Draško has an MSc in Applied Linguistics and Second Language Acquisition from University of Oxford, and a PhD in Theoretical and Applied Linguistics from University of Cambridge. And following his PhD, he worked as a postdoctoral research fellow at University of Leeds on quantifying bilingual experience, the QBEX project. And his research expertise and interest include multilingualism, autism, autistic-like traits, and language disorders. Currently, he's leading a cross-departmental reading group on multilingualism, language varieties, and neurodiversity. So welcome, Draško. I'm really, really excited for the talk today. Thank you.
Thank you, Vishnu, and thank you, Holly, for the invitation. I hope you can see the slides. They should be full screen any second now. I hope this is okay.
Yeah, perfect.
Great, thank you. Thank you for this invitation. Today I'll be presenting the work that I worked on with Mari Carmen Parafita-Couto from Leiden University. So this is a scoping review on code switching or language mixing in neurodevelopmental conditions. And based on the research that I outline, I'll draw some implications for bilingual families, for practitioners, but also researchers in this area. So just some quick talk outline. I'll briefly mention terminology-related approach. We'll look at the rationale for the research questions and why choosing a scoping review rather than any other review method. I'll outline the procedure, and then while talking about the synthesis of our findings and future steps, I'll also draw implications for the different groups that I mentioned in the title. So when it comes to terminology, it might seem superfluous to define some of these, but considering the complication and also, I guess, lack of consensus in terms of some of these across the literature, for the purposes of this particular study, Mari Carmen and I decided to take a somewhat global approach, or rather all-inclusive approach. So as bilingualism, we treated anyone with the knowledge or use of 2 or more languages to any degree. So this would be synonymous for anyone who's a trilingual or multilingual. When it comes to code switching, this is the one where it might be a controversial approach, but generally under this we refer to the use of more than one language in an utterance or in a conversation. However, you can see here a mixture of terms that are used across the literature. Not all of them are synonyms. They can actually, structurally speaking, refer to quite different things, or in some cases, theoretically speaking, they can represent different theoretical approaches, like, for example, code switching and translanguaging, which in some studies are treated as synonyms, while in other studies, they have a very different, and indeed, theoretically speaking, they seem to have a different theoretical approach. When it comes to the third key term, so as to say, that will appear throughout the talk, it's neurodevelopmental conditions, which is often in the literature referred to as neurodevelopmental disorders. So here we refer to the set of conditions that come under the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the 5th edition, or the DSM-5. And you can see some of the example of what sort of conditions we refer to when we use this term. So what motivated this study? One of the things that we have observed in the literature, but also in our own research, is concerns that generally families of neurodivergent children and individuals have or receive about bilingualism, right? So in a recent study that was led by Bérengère Desgardes, we actually found that parents of autistic bilinguals often receive negative advice about raising their autistic kids bilingually. And here, you see testimonies from 2 of the parents from that particular study, and on purpose, I kind of kept the parents' response, which was typed verbatim, without correcting their response. So you can see, for example, that one of the parents said the speech and language therapist suggested our son with special needs couldn't learn the language as others, so we should stick with one language with him. While another parent mentioned at the beginning she wasn't speak any word and started to speak in language therapy in English. Unfortunately, I have to pick the English over my mother tongue. So we see here that even though this was a recent study from 2023, it replicated the findings that have been kind of dominating in the field of bilingualism and autism in particular for the last, well, more than the last decade. And that negative advice or concerns about bilingualism still remains present in the literature. But as we see from these quotes, the parents often feel forced to select the societal language in favor of the other language, even though based on what we have seen in this data, the parents don't necessarily feel most comfortable with using the societal language, in this case, English, which can then obviously affect the way in which they communicate with the child and the qualitative aspects of that communication. When it comes to these concerns about bilingualism, even though they seem to be still unfortunately prevalent in the literature, we do have evidence that currently there are no detrimental effects of bilingualism for development. So I'm referring here to 2 reviews on this topic that have been done so far, among actually quite a few others that have come out recently. So Uljarevich and colleagues focused on multilingualism across neurodevelopmental conditions, while Pravo and Teller focused specifically on autistic bilinguals. And both reviews found no evidence that bilingualism has a detrimental effect on the development of these neurodivergent individuals. So even though there is still that stigma present, current state of the art on the topic doesn't seem to support that fear of bilingualism. In fact, we know from a body of literature on neurodivergent individuals, but I would say also for some of these in neurotypical research as well, that bilingualism seemed to have some so-called benefits or advantages in certain areas, even though this first one, cognition, is under a big question mark, considering the replication crisis on this particular topic. But more importantly, I think that these 2 other bullet points are something that to bilingual families matters more. It seems that bilingualism does improve familial connections in the families that have neurodivergent family members, and it is also widening access to work and social opportunities for neurodivergent individuals. I'm pretty sure we can agree improves the life quality of individuals more than necessarily performing 100 milliseconds faster on a cognitive task. That said, so far the research has showed us that bilingualism doesn't seem to have any negative effects in neurodivergent individuals, but no work so far has focused on giving us overview of the findings in relation to the code switching practices, which for many multilingual communities are widely present. So when it comes to code switching, we know that this tends to be prevalent across bilingual communities, but obviously this can differ from community to community, but also within communities as well. One thing that we know about code switching from the research with neurotypical individuals is that code switching does indeed give us insight into areas such as language representation. It is also a sign of linguistic competence on bilinguals. There is some work, such as work by Julia Hofweber and colleagues, that indicates that certain type of code switching can lead to cognitive benefits or advantages of bilinguals. But also there is rich literature out there that shows that code switching gives us an insight into the community norms of bilinguals and how they communicate in general. Despite the fact that this is an extremely important topic for bilingual research, and it can have implications for practitioners who work with bilinguals, no review so far has addressed this phenomenon in neurodivergent individuals. And this is where our work kind of comes from. This was the main motivation for conducting this review. And in selecting the method that we would like to use to address this, we encountered scoping review as a method of looking at the available literature. And based on the methodological guidances, we found that this approach indeed is the best suited one because the aim is kind of to map out what's known on this topic without necessarily looking at the effectiveness, for example, of an intervention. So we basically want to cast the net as wide as possible to see what's out there and try to map it out, make sense of it, and importantly, identify any gaps or avenues for future research that can then inform more systematic reviews or other research that is necessary on the topic. So these were our research objectives that we kind of broadly classified in these five main aims. So first, we wanted to see in which neurodevelopmental conditions code switching has been investigated so far. But also we wanted to look at the approaches that were used to explore this particular topic. And I will talk, I guess it will become more clear what we mean by approaches when we present the data. We also were interested in describing the demographic and bilingualism related characteristics of these populations that were investigated, as well as any comparison in code switching practices between neurotypical and neurodivergent bilinguals. And finally, we wanted to get a sense of what sort of attitudes towards code switching the families in question tend to have, or communities in question, but also what kind of advice they might have been given by professionals in the field about code switching with their neurodivergent family members. Before conducting the review, to minimize any bias, we developed a protocol that the link to it you'll find later on the slides, and this is something that we posted on the USF. But when it comes to the search, we wanted to go first with the databases, and these were the databases that we looked at, but we were also worried that we will miss something if we just focus on the database search. So in addition to this, we posted a notice about our review via the ISB mailing list, InfoChild, and you can see here other mailing lists that we consulted, as well as social media platforms to advertise the research, and then ask for researchers who have worked on these topics to send us work that might not be still published, that might be in the form of a dissertation or a preprint for inclusion in our review. We did include great literature here, and this is something that scoping reviews are well suited for because they don't necessarily look only at published research. It could be an exclusion criteria, but considering that the little we knew about this topic, we thought that any work in progress would also be important to include. When it comes to the key term strategy, we kind of defined the three key terms along these lines. So the first criteria was participant related. So we looked at here at any terms that include neurodevelopmental conditions, and this list is actually much longer. This is just a small extract. We also used as synonyms, even though they're not really synonyms in all of the cases, but we used any terms or concepts that relate to, broadly speaking, to code switching, even though, for example, I mean, for those of you who are linguists, you will know that, for example, insertion and alternation are definitely not synonyms. But we wanted to basically identify any work, no matter they focus on whether they focuses on specific type of code switching or code switching in general under all these different terms. And finally, the third term referred to the bilingual or multilingual status. So we did use terminology that you see listed here. And for the full set of terms, in fact, you can find it together with other rules that we preset in this pre-registered protocol that is on the OSF page. So something to check out if you're interested, especially in the methodological aspect of this particular project. So what did we find? When it comes to the research through the databases, we found quite a few resources at the beginning, but then in addition to that, we also got some things sent to us by the authors, some things that we identified before the database search, and you can see here some of the things that came up during the manuscript revision or after the database search. We've also, at some point from these resources we found through databases, we looked at some of the references for the texts that were fully screened. So in total, when we combine all of these approaches, which you can kind of follow the map here to see the timeline in a way, we identified in the end only 31 sources on this particular topic, which, considering that we have also included gray literature and the literature that is not necessarily focusing primarily on code switching, but it might investigate it sporadically, it shows that the topic is actually quite scarcely investigated. Now, looking at our research aims, we found that in fact, in most of the studies, it was the language, broadly speaking, language disorder, which stands here for the terms such as language impairment, DLD, or SLI, as it used to be referred to, tends to be, together with autism, the most frequently explored neurodevelopmental conditions. We see sporadically here that studies here and there also include participants with some of the other conditions, such as stuttering or ADHD. Obviously, these numbers here don't add up to the total number of 31, because in certain studies we had individuals who had co-occurring conditions, so more than just one condition. But generally, we see that mostly the research so far focuses on a sort of a language impairment or autism as the condition when it comes to this particular topic. For the second research aim, this is something that I think might be of most interest to linguists and psycholinguists in particular. When it comes to the ways in which code switching has been studied across this research, we found that only 6 studies use spontaneous speech as an approach to investigate code switching by individuals with neurodevelopmental conditions. So these would be studies that would record language samples or record any mundane, spontaneous, or guided conversations. We found that 5 studies were experimental in nature, so this would include any sort of narrative tasks, either storytelling or story retelling. And then 6 studies were based on experimental design, so things like the sentence repetition task, acceptability judgment, and so on. There were 4 studies that included a combination of these approaches, either spontaneous and semi-experimental, or semi-experimental and experimental approaches, and then 10 studies that looked at code switching sporadically. It was not the main focus of the study, so there was no any particular design to tackle code switching. It just came out as one of the side things that was looked at. I will comment on this probably later on as well in the talk, but one of the things that we immediately notice here as concerning is that we don't really have a lot of studies that have looked at code switching in an ecologically valid way. And in fact, when we kind of address especially experimental approaches, we find that a lot of these tasks, in fact, do not tap into what is necessarily reflective of code switching practices by individuals in general. And some of the tasks, like cued language switching task, is more of a verbal cognitive task rather than a code switching task per se. So we find it concerning that some of the generalizations that are made in these studies are based on the tasks that don't really reflect the phenomenon that the authors are necessarily talking about. And this can have obviously then implications about the advice that is given to practitioners to then inform their practice when working with multilingual families with neurodivergent family members. I will return to this and we will look at implication of this in relation to some of the other aims. Now, when it comes to the third research aim, this is the summary of the demographic data, so I'll kind of go one by one. we see that, I mean, across the studies, it was quite hard to code this variable because in some studies, it was not specified whether the authors refer specifically to gender or sex. I believe that only one study asked about both of these questions separately. So we broadly kind of, and in most studies, it was either indicated as just gender or just sex. So we kind of combine this in a binary approach for the sake of summary in this table, but we do not have an approach that is similar in terms of coding this particular variable across studies. One of the things that is interesting in terms of the age distribution of participants, we see that for most studies so far, the participants tend to be, the neurodivergent participants tends to be 8 years or younger, and we have barely any research with neurodivergent teenagers or adults in relation to code switching practices. This actually reflects what has been found in a recent review on bilingualism and autism by Pervo and Thaler, where they also found rarely any research with autistic bilingual teenagers. And we suspect that the main reason for most studies being with the younger age is because this is where there is that fear about whether bilingualism, or in this case, code switching, represents any issues for the development in particular. So we suspect that this is what kind of drives research with the younger age rather than some of the older participants. When it comes to the socioeconomic status, this was an absolute nightmare to code. So we do acknowledge also that there is a limitation in the way that we coded this, and that it probably misrepresents the actual socioeconomic status of participants. What we did in the study is that, I mean, here one way of coding is looking at how the studies have operationalized socioeconomic status, and some of them use more than one measure, even though the education of individuals in the study or their caregivers tends to be the predominant ones. But another way we recoded this is whether, no matter how SES was operationalized, whether we can classify participants as mixed, low SES, medium SES, or high SES. And we do acknowledge the limitation here with our approach because, for instance, we agreed between ourselves as authors to unless there is another indicator of socioeconomic status, if we only have, for example, education of caregivers, if the caregiver has a university degree, we will code this as the high socioeconomic status. But we also acknowledge that this is not the good approach in coding the SES, and we even refer in the paper to some of the data that shows that families with, and this is something that I'm pretty sure you have experienced in your research, that families who have a university degree do not necessarily have a high annual income. So simply here, for the sake of summary, we had to have a certain approach of summarizing this, but we do acknowledge the limitation in our approach, and simply there is currently no consensus in terms of how to best approach SES in this field. So I would be very curious to see and learn from other fields about this particular variable. When it comes to before I go into the country and language combinations, with the sample size, we see here actually that most of the studies tend to be somewhere, well, first of all, most of the studies tend to be having under 20 neurodivergent individuals. And those are then almost equally split between the case studies that included between 1 to 3 participants, or those that included 4 to 20. And again, similar to Pervo and Thaler's review of research on bilingualism and autism, we see that there are that it's very rare to have studies that have over 20 neurodivergent individuals, which kind of brings under a question mark the generalizability of strictly quantitative approaches in this particular area of research when the samples are small. When it comes to the representation in terms of country and the language combinations, for the country, it might be easier to actually look at this map. So we see that actually we found that more than half of the studies come from the US on this particular topic, while the majority of the studies come from Northern America and Europe, and I would also dare say Western Europe. While the countries where, when you look at the rest of the map here, the countries in which, for example, multilingualism tends to be more of a community norm or something that is more generally accepted in the society, like these parts of the world, we see here that we barely have. I think that here in Singapore, we identified one study, but from the rest of the world, it's pretty much completely underexplored, and this could be also biased with the fact that we reviewed the literature only in the languages that were familiar to either me or Mari Carmen. But that said, we see that, again, quite underrepresentation on a topic about multilingualism. We have quite an underrepresentation from the most multilingual parts of the world where code switching happens to be normal communication. In terms of language combinations, we actually found that in all but 4 studies, English was one of the 2 languages involved. So the exceptions were 2 studies that included Catalan-Spanish bilinguals and 2 studies that included Dutch-Turkish bilinguals. In this one here, we had French and another language, and among these, there were also people who spoke French-English. So pretty much all studies apart from these 4 included English as one of the languages in the mix. That takes me to the 4th research aim, which might have most implications for practitioners like speech and language therapists and teachers. So when it comes to one of the things that we wanted to look at is whether code switching practices of neurodivergent individuals differ from those who are neurotypical. And we don't necessarily agree that this might be the best comparison to make, but it is often the approach taken in the literature of this kind to address the possible fears regarding code switching. This table might be hard to read, so I'll try to guide you through it. So first, from the 31 study that we identified, we found that only 14 studies included a comparison group or comparison individuals. 16 studies did not include comparison group or individuals, but some of them, these 4 in particular, would compare the performance in code switching of neurotypical, of their neurodivergent participants to what we know about code switching from the neurotypical literature. So even though there were no comparison groups, they would compare the neurodivergent individuals to what we know from literature on code switching. And then there was one study where this comparison was not applicable, and this was a study that included interview with speech and language therapists. So when it comes to trying to code whether there were any differences between the groups, I summarize it here a bit with color coding. So in 9 studies, we found that neurotypical and neurodivergent individuals do not differ or predominantly don't differ in their code switching. In 3 studies, we identified almost an equal amount of differences and similarities, while in 5 studies, we identified that the 2 groups were different or predominantly different in terms of how they code switch. So the majority, again, seems to be on this no difference side, but then we kind of delve this into qualitatively speaking. So the important message for practitioners would be that even when we identify the differences in published research, they're not necessarily a sign of concern. So you can see here some of the examples from different studies on the topic. For instance, we found that in a sentence repetition task in English stimuli, kids with developmental language disorder or DLD produce more non-target code switching than neurotypical children. Or children with language impairment showed a higher proportion of code switching than neurotypical kids. But this per se does not necessarily pose an issue, right? It is an observation. Or I don't know, one of the studies also mentioned that the DLD kids were different from the neurotypical comparison group in the fact that they produced proportionally more verbs in the other language and fewer nouns, right? So we do see some different patterns that have emerged in some of the studies. But importantly, among the studies that identified the differences between the group, only 1 study included the spontaneous speech approach, right? So they looked at spontaneously produced data. And in fact, that 1 study happened to be a case study, while another study included a combination of spontaneous speech data and semi-experimental data. So for most of the studies that identified some of the differences between code switching in neurotypical and neurodivergent individuals, they used experimental or semi-experimental approaches, which don't necessarily always reflect the ecologic validity of code switching. Importantly, in research, even in research that has looked at code switching from a more spontaneous point of view, looking at spontaneous speech, we find that the variability in some of the patterns that emerge, for example, whether more verbs or more nouns are code switched, this is something that this variability exists not only between neurodivergent and neurotypical individuals, but even between different neurotypical individuals, the variability can exist and has been found across these studies. So these differences per se do not necessarily indicate any danger of code switching practices. In fact, in quite a few of the studies that we reviewed, we identified that code switching was a positive communicative practice that actually helped neurodivergent individuals maintain relationships with their families. And that takes me to the final aim of this review, which kind of helps contextualize the previous slide as well. We found that when it comes to attitudes and advice on code switching that families of neurodivergent individuals received or express, we find that this is a severely understudied area. So for instance, when it comes to the advice on code switching, in 26 out of 31 studies, we found no data on this. And in those that we found data, there was no positive advice. It was predominantly negative, or in one case, both positive and negative. When it comes to attitudinal code switching, again, most studies had no data on this. And then from those that did, the the attitudes were predominantly negative. 3 studies included both positive and negative advice, and only 1 study was positive about code switching. And we do want to acknowledge that our coding approach might represent the gravity of the negative advice and attitude as well, because when we coded the data across these 31 studies, we focused only on very explicit mentioning in terms of advice and attitudes towards code switching. But we do note that in a larger number of studies, we found generally negative advice or attitude towards bilingualism, which, you know, if someone is not advised to raise their let's say, autistic children bilingually, there is also then implication that they shouldn't switch between languages, right? So if we had a less conservative approach where we didn't focus explicitly on the mention of code switching, but if we look at just attitudes towards bilingualism in general, I'm pretty convinced that we would find either higher presence of the negative advice or negative attitudes towards bilingual upbringing or bilingual communicative practices. To illustrate, you can see here, for instance, some of the quotes from the studies that we have identified with a reference to the exact study. So, for example, in one of the studies when it comes to attitudes, parents were also told that they were creating chaos in their child's mind by switching between languages and exposing their child to various words. The teachers and therapists then went on to issue further warnings, such as your child will become terribly confused or become more lost. This advice was given to families despite the reality that members of the families often spoke no English and would be unable to converse with the children if language choice was restricted. And then in another study from Ireland, the therapist appears cognizant of the threat of code switching in case of endangered languages such as Irish, in noting that the level of code switching in the bilingual children with specific language impairment was higher than expected. So one of the SLTs said, I have come across children who would use a lot more loan words than you would expect them to, so sticking this Irish progressive marker onto the end of English verbs, that kind of thing. Coincidentally, one of my Irish students actually, when we discussed this particular study, mentioned that even generally among Irish English bilinguals, they tend to do exactly the same thing with the Irish progressive marker, so kind of sticking it at the end of English words. And this is something, therefore, that doesn't need to pose any concern and then lead to the negative attitudes of code switching. So we see here that there is a I'm not sure I can say this word right, but we see here an example of how the speech that is common even among neurotypical bilinguals is pathologized and then linked to increasing these fears of code switching when it comes to neurodivergent individuals. So to kind of summarize the implications of what we found in this review, we identified that, in fact, code switching is quite important for communicative practices of bilingual families, no matter whether they have neurodivergent family members or not. So we do not have any evidence that practitioners, speech and language therapists, or teachers, or any other practitioners for that matter, should advise bilingual families not to code switch or use all of their languages with their neurodivergent family members. We, however, do caution that practitioners, as you might note already, should balance this advice to be kind of between the research-informed practice, but also respect the preferences of individuals and their families. To mention from the studies that we have reviewed, there was one study with, I think it was a case study of a child with stutter, where the child, for example, had negative attitude towards English, which in that context was, I believe, heritage language or home language rather than a societal language. So the child expressed quite a negative views every time English was used in the house. So this obviously shows that, you know, bilingualism or code switching, in fact, cannot be always forced, and that the preferences of the clients should be, in that case, respected. That said, we do think that practitioners should have that responsibility of informing the families of with neurodivergent family members who are bilingual about the state of the art in this topic, to show that currently we don't have any evidence about negative effects of bilingualism or code switching, so that the families who might have certain stigmas about these topics or who might have been exposed to the stigma about these topics can actually make informed decision about their practices. And finally, we think that when making conclusions about this particular topic and then advising practitioners and so on, we need to look at the ecological validity of the data before generalizations are made. And that kind of takes me to moving forward in terms of research. So these implications would, I guess, be more oriented towards researchers. So we do see that there is a bias in focus and demographic representation. So mostly we found studies on autism and DLD, but beyond these conditions, we don't really know much on this topic. We also find that there is a misrepresentation in a lot of demographic variables, and we do find it concerning that the most published or unpublished research on code switching still seems to come from the parts from North America and from Western Europe, or the parts of the world where, even though, of course, that in these parts of the world we do have multilinguals and multilingual communities, it is not something that is supported in the same way, and or a norm in the same way as in some of the extremely multilingual parts of the world. So we should actually be learning from those communities where code switching, in fact, is the norm, and then try to take those lessons and then implement them in communities here. We also find no suggestion of deficit due to code switching in development, but more research is required. We do see that, you know, we kind of took this global approach in how we define code switching. We would need more research in different types of code switching, but also across different types of participants. And finally, the evidence and attitudes and professional advice is lacking, right? So this is something that requires further investigation in order to kind of tackle the reasons for this advice, or the reason for this attitude that exists across communities. When it comes to some methodological and practical issues, we do find the validity of strictly experimental approaches probably problematic. So for example, if a study uses a cute picture naming task, and then based on this switching task makes generalization about language mixing practices of neurodivergent bilinguals, this could actually misinform practice, because it could lead with wrong advice that mixing might or might not be good. So this is something that we caution researchers about. So if there are implications to be drawn, especially for practitioners or bilingual families, it is important to clarify whether the study in fact looks at code switching, right? Which would be much better explored through spontaneous approaches, or some even semi-experimental approaches like narrative elicitation tasks, which reflect the code switching practices of these individuals and communities much better. Finally, we have seen that the numbers are quite small across the studies. On the one hand, there is a question of if the research that gets published on this topic keeps having smaller sample, is there a value then for strictly quantitative approaches where we don't have analysis with enough statistical power, or should we move more towards qualitative research that might be more informative, especially when we are dealing with the case studies? On the other hand, we would need a shift towards more inter-lab collaborations to possibly create aggregated data sets to address the replication crisis, which obviously can happen only with open science. But this again has to take into account ethical considerations of their communities and how their data is used, so that their data is not end up creating products that then the community will be charged for later in terms of support. Finally, a community-based approach and learning from communities where code switching is the norm is something that is necessary, but for all of this, we do need slow science. This is for those of us who are UK-based. implications for extremely problematic systems such as REF. We can't rush research. We can't do things in 3 or 4 years that take time. In fact, recently, I believe one of the studies by Girolamo and colleagues in the US showed that it took them, I think, 5 to 7 years to collect data from 18 autistic bilinguals who were also racialized through a community-based approach. So good research and takes time, and we need this reorientation of slow science. And this is, I guess, implication for funders that they can't expect us to work with vulnerable communities at speed and produce high quality research at the same time. So I will stop here, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Draško. That was absolutely fascinating. We have one question in the chat, or did you want to start, Vishnu, and then I'll move to the chat? Oh, Janine's already ready on camera. Maybe I'll start with Janine.
I can wait. You just go ahead.
You go. You were first in.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Draško. I've enjoyed it very much. I think you are really onto something very important, because most people have looked at code switching in the sort of the typical populations in bilingual communities across the world. Those, unfortunately, still in typical populations, it is still mainly the Western world.
Yeah.
But we are getting there more now with studies of code switching into Malaysia or Africa and so on. So what I also liked very much is that you started out by looking at it in a very differentiated way. So not throwing together all types of code switching in one basket, but actually paying attention to the typological differences that there are. So there's one thing about different types of code switching that struck me also when you went into differences between nouns and verbs. So one thing that could be looked at is that in most data sets across the entire world, it is switches of single nouns that are most frequent, right? So one obvious thing to look at is if in the data that you have or that are reported in the literature, that is also the case with atypical populations. So, the null hypothesis would be, of course, that it's going to be the same, right? That is what you would kind of hope, right? Perhaps if you want to make the recommendation that it's all doesn't matter very much, it is not damaging, then you're going to hope to find, okay, they switch more nouns than anything else, right? So that's wonderful. But for verbs, it's another matter, because verbs, you need very specific strategies to encapsulate them. There are suffixes that you use to take a verb from one language, put it in another language, you take a particular suffix, or you have a kind of helping verb. So that's quite a different ball game. So if that is being found much more often, then that is an interesting thing to focus on.
Yeah.
So then the other thing is the community norms that you emphasized quite rightly. So why would people be worried if code switching is a community-wide thing, right? As it is in Malaysia. I was there recently last year twice, and it's just also among academics, in the courtroom, and wherever you go, in informal and formal situations, everybody code switches between English and Malay, or between Chinese and English, or whatever. So there it's quite a normal thing. So then I would assume that in those kinds of situations, there can't be a problem with code switching, right?
Yeah.
But in other situations, in Berlin, there's a family that I know, they have as a rule, one language per sentence, right? That's a family policy.
How successful are they in maintaining that is my question.
Well, that's always a big thing, right? People say they do one thing and in reality they do something else. So community norms, that's just what I want to say, are very different across the world. Yeah. And maybe in the Western world is kind of keep things separate is much more common than in other parts of the world. But that might be too much of a generalization. So just as a general comment, I think you're really on the right track by trying to combine these community norms, right? Not just looking at the whole literature, but really looking at what does that community do, and how do these people with particular impairments or whatever differ from what's happening locally. But I'll leave it to you to
Yeah,
give us some thoughts on this.
Thank you for the contribution, and I agree. And I also think that the community norm is so important to always have as a context, because within the community we can see and expect variation or variability, not to mention also cross-generational differences possibly that might occur in code switching. Yeah. But one of the things that makes then this task going forward much harder is, and we talk about this in this actually will be a chapter rather than a paper in the forthcoming volume, but we talk about when we look at the studies on this topic and on bilingualism in neurodivergent individuals in general, we consistently see negative advice towards these practices. So the families are already restricting how they use their languages or how they code switch. So why should we then expect neurodivergent individuals to show us and replicate the norms that neurotypicals around them do if they are not exposed necessarily to same input, right? If a parent of an autistic child, they said don't code switch with them, why would we then expect that autistic child to code switch in the same way as their neurotypical siblings who might not have that restriction in their input? And this is why I think with community norms, we also need to look at those attitudes and advice to contextualize the findings. Otherwise, we might have these dangerous conclusions of saying, well, neurodivergent group was different than neurotypical. And I think in one of the studies, they even suggest that maybe differences in code switching could be possibly used as one of the diagnostic things to look at, which I believe is completely wrong, right? It's not, and I think unfortunately the Irish context that I referred to here from one of the studies shows in a way negative effects of revitalization of an endangered language. So I completely see why the effort goes into using more of the Irish, but if spontaneous practices are kind of not banned but frowned upon, that also won't do good to individuals in question, right?
I think there are, if I may, one comment in reply, and then I will hand over back. But I think one of the problems with bilinguals is this word finding problems, right? That we all have. So if we restrict the code switching in a child with neurogenetic disorders, then we're actually depriving them of solving these word finding problems. Because if you tell them you can only use English with me, then that's not helpful. If the child happens to know that word in French, but is then prevented from using it because that would be code switching, that is just dramatic for the child, right? We shouldn't do that. So that could be one thing that might be helpful in the advice given to parents. Don't restrict their expression possibility. This is the one thing that the translanguaging literature always emphasizes, right? Use all the resources that you've got. Right? Well, that is kind of a very generic statement, and I've always sort of having problems with people making such generic statements. It is, in a way, it is a helpful thing for practitioners to know that you can help children by allowing them access to the resources they've got. But I won't dominate this further. Other people might want to comment.
Vishnu, have you got a question?
Yeah. So talking about translanguaging, Draško, I noticed one of your criteria for search was concept-based, was translanguaging.
Yeah.
And I know there is this tension between code mixing and translanguaging. So I wondered, how did you include, did you distinguish between code switching and translanguaging in your study? And did you also look into studies that looked at translanguaging in developmental disabilities?
Yeah, so thanks for that question. We included that because we didn't know what we will find, right? But from memory, if I remember well, I don't think that from any research so far we can identify a translanguaging approach in individuals who are neurodivergent, right? And I think that this is something that is in that sense also lacking method in the methodological design. And I do think that when I talked about that case study approach, from my experience of investigating autism in general, especially in relation to bilingualism, the more I'm into this field, the more I'm seeing the value of qualitative approaches or mixed methods approaches, where I think that translanguaging can fit more nicely than strictly quantitative approaches, because so frequently, even when there are bigger samples, as you have seen in these studies and in some of the other reviews that I mentioned, we rarely have any research that has more than 20 neurodivergent individuals. So how well can we, model that data? How well can we generalize? We actually will probably learn more from a translanguage and qualitative mixed method approach. Unfortunately, we didn't identify any study, I believe, that used that approach, or at least not in the sense that translanguage is now evolving in the neurotypical literature. So I am looking forward to seeing more of that. And we did put by the way, the protocol, this preprint, and the data are all put on our OSF page. So if anyone wants to dig further into that data set, feel free to, it's openly available. Of course, we don't have the actual data from each study. We wish we did, but at least you will have a summary that you can then play with for any follow-up research questions.
Lena, do you want to come on and ask your questions, or I can ask them for you if you... Yeah.
Sure, I can ask as well. So I've typed in the chat there. Right. I have two questions. Well, first of all, thank you for the talk. One of the questions was something I might have missed simply. So did you use a specific tool to appraise the quality of your studies, and what was the overall conclusion?
Yeah, we didn't. We mentioned this, I believe, in the protocol. We didn't approach this review with an appraisal, which is kind of why we decided to select a scoping review. But one of the things that emerges in terms of the quality of the studies can be found throughout different result sections, right? So, for example, when we talk about socioeconomic status, we do discuss in detail the flawed approach of relying solely on education, or one of the ways of operationalizing it. But because we try to kind of scope what's out there, it was really hard to have one appraisal tool that will work for all kind of resources that we will find, especially because we decided to include grey literature, which could have included more than just unpublished research. It could have included maybe presentations or posters and so on. So we decided to opt out from using one particular appraisal tool. Yeah, I don't know whether that answers.
Yeah. But I think it also suggests something about the strength of recommendations that I guess we can make from a study.
Yeah. One thing that might be seen as an indicator is that we found that most of the studies in the review are published. I think only a few are based on a dissertation or a preprint that is in progress or under review. So the large majority of the studies actually are published peer-reviewed research, which I guess it's not universally a guaranteed quality indicator, but yeah.
I guess it's something.
Yeah.
And my second question was more looking forward into the future. I'm just curious if you and your team have any specific plans for future empirical work stemming from.
Thank you for that question, Mari Carmen. I mean, this is a topic that I've been writing up to work on since my PhD days at some point in 2017, if I remember well. So look where I'm now. Mari Carmen and I are actually working on a grant to develop this topic further now that we've done the review. But again, it will depend on any successful funding and all the restrictions that it comes with. I am a bit concerned in general. I mean, obviously, I want to see more teams have grants that then pursue this topic further because there are so many things to look at. But I am concerned about the issues that we're facing now in the UK academia with the funders, especially with, I'm trying to be polite here, the REF framework, because we really think that slow science is the thing that will give us good findings, that will give us high quality research. And from what I see from any funding available to me personally or to my collaborators, it always includes grants that you get between 3 to 5 years, which if we really want to do high quality research on this topic with the groups that are often labeled as hard to recruit, I don't think we can do much very fast. I don't know how willing the funders are to listen to us, and I don't think this is a UK-based problem. So that is my big concern, and I think it will be a while until we have more high-quality research, but I definitely plan to work on this.
And if I can ask a quick follow-up question, obviously I wish you all the luck and success in these pursuing these. What methodology do you kind of prefer to work on if you are within the what you've described as slow science paradigm? So what kinds of methodologies are you thinking of?
I mean, I would like to have a community-informed approach. which basically means that the first stage of the research would be open to modification of how the data is collected, how the data is importantly stored and shared later on, because I do think that there are some serious ethical implications here. I am obviously in favor of open science, but we can't also blindly just share people's data without, thinking about who will use this later to develop, let's say, an app or a service that then the community will be charged for. So that sort of things of surveillance capitalism comes under the big question mark, right? And that's why I think that, I wish I had a design that's ready and that I would willingly share, and it would be great that then if it could be replicated across countries. But I do think that we need to do this in collaboration with the community that we study, which then will also allow this contextualization of community norms that we talked about. Yeah.
Thank you.
I would definitely move away in the early stages to kind of mirror what has been recently suggested in the neurotypical literature on code switching, where I strongly believe that we first need to focus on ecologically valid data, so maybe more on spontaneous speech, and then from whatever findings emerge there, design possibly any experimental studies. And I think that Betty Martinez and colleagues have recently written and published about this in general on code switching research, that psycholinguistic design should be based on what we actually find in spontaneous data, rather than start with experimental approaches and then making assumptions about spontaneous speech. So my preference would be to start from spontaneous speech.
Thank you. I think we better wrap up because we've only got 2 minutes to go. I think the slow science thing's so interesting, isn't it? Because it's almost like it's encouraging when you've got sort of hard to reach or whatever people call them populations. It's almost encouraging small samples, isn't it? Which is supposed to be bad science. But if it's going to take you a long time to recruit participants, obviously you need more time in order to get a sample that you can then generalize from. So yeah, it's kind of interesting, that kind of is a contradiction, isn't it, that you're criticized if you have a small sample, but then you're not given the resources you need to get a larger sample.
Exactly. Holly, if I can just expand on that, and I do hope that this is, I don't know whether it's still recorded, I do hope it is, if anyone watches this later, especially any senior management teams, I think that we can't pretend that, our working conditions don't come into play here, because, to give you an example, the scoping review that I believe is conducted to a high standard is something that my university will likely not use in the ref, right? Because it's a review, it's not an original study. So we always have this pressure to publish, and then when you publish, is this a quantitative large-scale study, or is this a case study that maybe according to ref doesn't have the value? But all of these different methods, quantitative, qualitative, mixed, or different types of reviews, have their methodological strength and importance. So I think that we can't ignore the pressure of ref that actually, I believe, creates a lot of bad science as the outcome, rather than helping us actually investigate what needs to be investigated.
Yeah. And actually I know we're going over time now, but when you described, all of the languages and all of the parts of the world and the SES, and you really went into, that was just so much more informative to me as a kind of consumer of a scoping review stroke systematic review, compared to these huge scale ones where you don't get into the detail in that way. So you don't really have a good understanding of what's been included. So yeah, I agree. Anyway, we better stop, and we better not get ourselves into trouble for saying things we shouldn't. So thank you, everybody. It's been really fascinating, and if you'd like to watch it again, please feel free to visit our YouTube channel. And thank you. Another thank you to Draško.